I'm very happy to personally welcome to you today at the BSE campus in Belaterra. I want to take this opportunity to wish you a very fruitful year, full of learning experiences, and to make myself available for anything you might need. The program directors, the faculty, the program officers, Arianna, Elga, and all the team work to ensure that you have a successful and a unique learning experience. I hope you are enjoying the first months at the BSE. And beyond the intense brush-up courses, I hope you also had the opportunity to explore the BSE area and to slowly get to know each other. This will be a very special year. Some of your classmates will become your friends, and all of them will be part of your network for the rest of your life. I would be not surprised if over your professional career you often meet other members of the BSE community. Today, we gather to officially open the 25-26 academic year with the inaugural lecture given by Professor Lídia Farré. After the lecture, you will have the opportunity to watch something remarkable, the Castellers, human towers. This is a Catalan tradition, quite spectacular, and I'm sure you will enjoy it very much. The Castellers work as a team to achieve some amazing results in the same way that you will work together during the master to learn to take the maximum out of this year. I won't tell you more about the Castellers, but you definitely need to stay to see it. Let's start today's opening with the BSE lecture, delivered, as I just said, by Lídia Farré. Let me briefly introduce her. Lídia Farré is a tenured researcher of the Institute of Economic Analysis, which is one of the 4 academic units of the BSE. She holds a PhD Economics from the European University Institute in 2006. Lídia is well recognized internationally as a leader in the field of gender economics, with a focus on labor and public economics. She has many publications in the field, has been acting as advisor for different international organizations and governments, and delivers several keynote speaker lectures. Currently, she's associate editor of the Journal of the Spanish Economic Association, led various projects on gender and labor markets, and served as on the Spanish Council of Economic Advisors. She also contributes to the society by writing regularly in newspapers. As many of you also know very well, Lídia is also the director, together with Joan Llull, of the Economics of Public Policy Master Program within the BSE Specialized Economic Analysis. Without further delay, let me give the floor to Lídia Farré, who will deliver a speech on why do gender gaps persist in the labor market.
Okay, so thank you, Ada, for this very nice introduction. And let me also welcome you to the academic year and especially to the Belaterra campus. As you've seen on the way from the station, this is a very green and beautiful campus. So you are very welcome here. The question I'm gonna try to address today with my lecture is why do gender gaps persist in the labor market? This is not an easy question to solve, and I would say that we don't have a definite answer, but we have some ideas of why do these gaps persist. Okay, so actually what I'm gonna do in my lecture today is provide a revision of the state of the art in the field of gender economics, which, as you may guess, is my field of research. Okay, so along the presentation, I'm going to be also commenting on my contributions to this area of research. Okay, so let's start with a brief definition of what gender economics is about. So it's a field within economics that deals with analyzing how gender differences affect and are affected by economic decisions, public policies, and social structures. The main objective of this field is to measure gender inequalities in various dimensions, identify the causes, and propose measures to reduce and ideally eradicate these gaps, improving at the same time both equity and economic efficiency. I think it was great for the field the fact that Claudia Goldin received the Nobel Prize in 2023 for her pioneering work on the situation of, or the evolution of women, the evolution of the situation of women in economics. By the way, Claudia Goldin was the third woman in winning the Nobel Prize in its 50 years of history. And she was the first one winning the prize alone, because the other two laureates, Stella Duflo and Elinor Ostrom, won it with their male co-authors. So big achievement for the field and the profession in general. So why shall we care about gender gaps? Well, in particular in the labor market. So the first thing is that they are all over the place. So in this map, it's a bit weird to present this way, but I'm gonna do my best. Okay. So in this map, what you can see is the gender gaps in labor force participation between in different countries around the world. Okay. So on average, if we look at the average numbers, we see that female labor force participation is about 30 percentage points lower than that of men. Of course, there is a lot of dispersion around the globe, okay? But this is an important number. And more important, there are areas where this difference is larger than 50 percentage points, okay? These are the figures in terms of labor force participation, but there are other margins where we also observe differences between men and women. In particular, if we focus on those who actually work and look at their wages, we see that on average at the OECD, on average in the OECD, women make 12% less than men on average. Okay, then of course you need to take into account many things, but those are the aggregate figures. If we look at another margin, which is very important, that is gender gaps in leadership positions or decision making positions, here the differences are also important. So look at ministers. In the in the European Union, only 30% are women. This number is a bit lower in the US. But in the private sector, the situation looks even worse. Only 5% of the CEO positions are occupied by women. The number is 6% in the US. If we look at executive boards, the percentage is a bit larger, but still far away from parity. And if we move now to the academia, we also see gaps in our profession. Only in Europe, 24% of the full professors are women. The percentage is a bit higher in the US. Okay, so as a result of this underrepresentation of women in leadership positions, what we observe is that women obviously are also underrepresented at the top of the income distribution. So why is it important to not reduce but eradicate gender gaps? So I have the feeling that for many years, when we talk about gender equality, we were talking about social justice. Okay, so we need to promote equality because men and women need to be equal and so on. But it's more than social justice, it's about economic efficiency. So, under the assumption that talent is equally distributed across genders, and I haven't found evidence that this is not the case, then the lack of women in certain segments of the economy suggests a misallocation of resources with important costs for society and the aggregate economy. So then, eliminating gender gaps, it's important to improve economic efficiency. And I would like to cite this paper published in Econometrica, which you know it's one of the top journals in economics, in 2019, showing that between 20% and 40% of the GDP growth in the US between 1960 and 2010 can be attributed to improvements in the allocation of talent, and in particular, to changes in the occupational distribution of men and women, and also ethnic minorities. So there is a number I like in this paper that illustrates this change in the occupational distribution, that is the following, right? In the 1960s, 96% of lawyers and doctors were men. And in 2010, this percentage had decreased to 62%. So these are the type of of changes in the occupational distribution of talent that these authors analyze in the paper. So highly recommended this work. Okay. So I'm, as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to answer the question of why gender gaps are so persistent in the labor market today. But I think that to understand the persistency, we need to have a look of what happened in the past. Or more precisely, we need to look at the evolution of gender gaps, at least during the last decades. Okay? And as you can see from this picture on your left, okay, you have the evolution of female labor force participation in the US. So the percentage of women who actively participate in the labor market, so those who have a job or are looking for a job, since the beginning since the end of the 19th century. Okay, so what you can see from this picture is one of the most dramatic changes in modern labor markets. That is the drastic increase of women uh, in the labor market. Okay, so the increase of this dramatic increase of female labor force participation, jumping from around 30% by or around the 50s to about above 70% by 2020 or 2010, okay? Because I'm going to be talking of what happens during the last 2 decades, okay? But you see this almost 50 percentage points increase in female labor force participation during the past century, okay? If you look to the right, you see the evolution of female labor force participation. First thing to notice is that the scale is different. Okay, so what you see is that it's flat for a period and then it decreases a bit. This decreases about 10 percentage points. Okay, and it's mainly due to changes in the retirement age. Okay, so much more interesting trying to understand why women increased their participation. During the past century. Okay, and as you can imagine, there is a large literature trying to understand why this happened. Okay, I'm gonna mention some of the reasons, ignoring the authors, right? But I must say that some of the authors who contributed to these explanations are professors at the BSc. Okay. So what changed or what happened during the last century? What Claudia Golding refers to the quiet revolution. Okay, so first there was an expansion of the service sectors, offering jobs that were more appropriate to women. There were technological advances that affected the productivity both inside and outside the house. This is the vacuum cleaner effect, for instance. So you clean the house faster and you free part of your time and you can work outside the house. There were also reductions or eliminations of discrimination in countries such as the US, but also Spain. There were marriage bars that didn't allow married women to work. So once you eliminate this restriction, of course, female labor force participation increases. There was a very important expansion of public education that started in the US in the 50s and then continued in other places such as Europe. Very important, the introduction and diffusion of contraceptives allow women to take control of their fertility, that is, to decide when to have kids. Okay? And this was very important for the professional career of women. And also, changes in expectations about the returns on investments in human capital. Okay, let me talk about a little bit about this last point, these changes in expectations that I think it's well illustrated by this picture. So when young women at the beginning of the 20th century were thinking about the decision of whether to invest or not in human capital, that is, whether to go to school or university, they looked at their mothers and they saw that their mothers had to interrupt their careers to take care of their families. And then the returns to education were relatively short in time, right? Because they anticipated that after a while, they would have to stop and raise the family. Okay. But as female labor force participation increased, okay, the expectations of these young women, of all the younger generations, changed, right? When women started to massively or substantially or increase their participation in the labor market, the returns to education changed, right? Because these young women could see, or women from younger generations could see that their mothers kept working even after having kids. Okay, so this change in expectations is a very important factor to understand the increase in female labor force participation. And actually, you see that a bit later. So remember the first graph where you saw the increase in female labor force participation very pronounced after the 50s? So you see the translation into the enrollment rates at university, right? So you see these enrollment rates increasing slightly after the 50s, but see what happens after the 70s. The female enrollment rates overtake that of males. And nowadays, in all developed countries, female enrollment rates at university are higher than that of men. Okay, but still, gaps persist in other domains. So I just said that this change in expectations is important. So looking at what older generations are doing, it's important to form the returns to education. And related to that, some authors have worked on the intergenerational transmission of social norms, right? So where social norms are the role of men and women, or refers to the role of men and women in the society. Okay, so I'm mentioning or citing this paper because this is one of my favorite papers in economics. So you see the title there, but I refer to this paper as Marrying Your Mom. Okay? So what they show in this paper, Raquel Fernandez and co-authors, is that the increase in female labor force participation in the labor market changes the preferences of sons of men, about the type of woman they want as a wife, right? And what they show in this paper is that if your mother works, then the probability of marrying a woman that works is much higher. So a positive correlation between your labor supply as a woman and the labor supply of your mother-in-law. Okay? So I have one of my first publications was in this area of research. And so what we do in this paper is to show empirically that attitudes toward gender roles are transmitted between or across generations and affect human capital investment decisions, as well as the labor supply of the younger generation. So more recently, I have worked on a project with some of my co-authors where we show that public policies may have an effect on social norms and may transform or affect social norms. Okay, this has been a very time-consuming and costly project, and hopefully it will see the light soon. But what we do in here is to combine data from a field and a laboratory experiment with the natural experiment introduced, or the natural experiment that resulted from introducing the paternity leave permit in Spain in 2007. Okay, what we're doing here is that this policy, by promoting gender equality within households, so by changing household dynamics, affects the behaviors and expectations of the younger generation. Okay, and just to show you a little bit how this paper was produced, because sometimes it's writing papers can be, you can go outside the office, okay? So what we did in this case is to collect data. So we went to several schools, we interview kids, we ask kids to solve a questionnaire and to play some mathematical and other type of games. And then we did a proper econometric analysis with this data. So we exploited this change in the reform, and we use as an exogenous source of variation. All these things I'm saying will become clear by the end of the course, after by the end of the year, after taking my course and other courses that are at the BSc, okay? So what basically we are doing is to compare kids that were born right before and right after the introduction of the policy, okay? And under some assumptions, we can identify the causal effect of the reform, okay? What we see here is the reported, or the effect of the policy on the reported expectations of these kids regarding their situation in the labor market in 20 years when having kids, okay? So what you can see from here is that boys whose fathers were eligible for the paternity leave permit were less likely to report that they would be working full-time when having kids, while girls, if any, were more likely to report that they would be working full-time, right? So we see some kind of gender convergence in expectations of labor force participation among the future or the next generation, okay? So the conclusion of this paper is that public policies can change social norms and have effects on gender equality, but it may take time, okay? So this is the part on the historical evolution, or the history of gender gaps. Now let's move to what's going on today, and that's the picture of what's going on today. Okay, I'm gonna give you more details on that. So, as I said, one of the most important transformations of the labor markets, in the last century, was this increase in female labor force participation. But what we observe since the last 15 years is an stagnation in gender convergence. Okay, so gender gaps in terms of participation, wages, leadership, and so on, are kind of persistent. So they stay like that. So they have improved compared to what happened 15 years ago, but now we are not making progress. Okay, so for the last 15 years, we are there stuck to this 10, 25, 10, 15%, depending on the outcome that you use to measure gender disparities in the labor market. Okay, so I think that researchers doing work on gender economics, we all agree that, well, let me say something before that. So this goes hand in hand. So this persistency goes hand in hand with what it's called the child penalty. I don't like this term because poor kids, right? I prefer motherhood penalty. Okay. So what's the motherhood penalty? That's the picture for Spain, but don't worry, the pattern is the same all over the place, and I'm gonna show you the child penalty atlas. So what we see is in this picture is that, so the red line is when you have the first kid. So before having the first kid, the earnings of men and women are quite similar once you control by education, occupation, age, everything that it's observed. Okay. Then what you see is that a drop in the earnings of women. Okay, so the solid lines are women, the dashed lines are men. What you see is a drop in the earnings of men, and this drop persists. Okay, so 10 means 10 years after the birth of the kid. Okay, so you see that on average, having a kid penalizes more or penalizes women, actually, because the earnings of men are not really affected. Okay, so as I said, this is the picture for Spain, but there is a very famous paper called the Child Penalty Atlas. Okay, and what you can see is that for all countries for which we have data, we observe this drop in the earnings of women after the birth of the first kid and how it persists over time. Okay? And the magnitude may vary depending on the country, but is significant in most countries, even in the Scandinavian countries that are known to be quite gender egalitarian. Okay, even in these countries, you find this phenomenon. Now, the causes. Okay, so why are gender gaps so persistent? When, as I said, most of us agree that a large fraction of the gender gap in the labor market today originates within households as a result of the unequal distribution of care and domestic responsibilities. Okay, so it's this unequal distribution of unpaid work that generates the gender gaps in paid work. Okay, so then if the origin of gender gaps is within households, the question is not easy to solve. Okay, so there are a few ideas to reduce gender gaps in the labor market. Some researchers have talked about changing the way we work, so going for more flexible employment or more flexible work practices. And others, and this is part of my research, look at family policies that allow parents to be both, right? So fathers and mothers, but also workers. Okay. And in particular, I've done a lot of research on the paternity leave permit in Spain, and I'm going to explain you why. Okay. Um, so let me talk a little bit about this idea of changing the way we work to reduce gender gaps. Okay. So Claudia Goldin wrote a paper in 2014 where she um, talks about two different types of jobs or occupations. Okay, so the more flexible jobs were wages are linear to hours. Okay, so there is a linear relationship between the amount of hours you work and your wage. And then the so called greedy jobs, okay, where working certain hours, for instance, late at night or working long hours, have higher returns. Okay, so at the same time, you see that the more flexible jobs are taken in a large proportion by women, while the greedy jobs are more often taken by men. Okay, so I can also illustrate these two types of jobs by the flexible jobs, those that allow you to be an on-call parent. Okay, and then the greedy jobs that are those that allow you to be an on-call employee. Okay, and actually I would like to refer to the picture on your right. Okay, so this is a picture taken by a friend of mine and also a very good labor economist, Laura Spidel. So it's a picture she took at the Frankfurt airport. It was pre-COVID. Okay, so it's somewhere in October 2019. Okay, at 10 p.m. when she was returning from a conference at the European Central Bank. Okay, so what you can see is that at that time, or at that time of the day, only, or the airport in Frankfurt is mostly or only populated by men, who are the ones who seem to work until late, right? So I think that this picture is quite illustrative of what a greedy job means. Okay, so there has been some work on the relationship between work flexibility and gender equality. And I would like you to highlight some of the most relevant results in this literature. So, for instance, recent work by Le Barbachon and co-authors show that women accept or are willing to accept lower wages in exchange for shorter work commutes. And the trade-off is not small. Okay, so if you have a look at the paper, it's very interesting. They use administrative data, so high quality data. I also have a paper on this topic looking, and what we show in this paper is that the increasing commuting times in the US can partly explain the stagnation in gender convergence in labor force participation during the last decades. Then Alex Mas and Amanda Palas have a paper showing or providing evidence that women value work flexibility more than men, but this is not enough to explain the differences in gender gaps that still persist in the US. Okay, so using these techniques, so this last paper is, so the first one is administrative data, the second one is survey data, the third one is a discrete choice experiments. Those are different type of data and different ways to collect data that you also gonna learn along the year. Okay, so using this discrete choice experiment technique, I also have a recent paper with some co-authors where we showed that post-COVID, so the results that I showed in the previous slide were pre-COVID. So post-COVID, we don't really observe gender differences in terms of valuations of workplace flexibility. So when you look at telework, commuting times, schedule flexibility, we don't really find that men and women value these job attributes or these job amenities differently. And what we do find is that there are important gender differences in the evaluation of work climate and in particular in the evaluation of sexual harassment. That's another growing area of research with a lot of incidents in the labor market, but I'm not going to talk about it today because I don't have time and the results are still too preliminary. So, yeah, so this is about workplace flexibility and gender gaps. Now, let me very briefly summarize the research I've been doing on paternity leave for the last maybe 7, 8 years. So I have several papers with several co-authors, and if I have to summarize the results in 2 minutes, first I could say that this is a very important policy. Okay, so this policy, if you look at family policies, the paternity leave is being introduced all over, at least in European countries. So there are 2 weeks of mandatory leave in all countries, and they are pushing to extend it. Okay, so what's the situation in Spain? So nowadays, Spain has the most generous paternity leave permit among the OECD countries. Since 2021, the paternity leave has been equalized in duration to that of maternity leave. It's 16 weeks, 6 of them mandatory, it's fully paid, and cannot be transferred to the mother. Okay? And this is the type of policy where the design matters a lot for utilization. Okay? So we have observed in all countries that when these weeks can be transferred to the mothers, men do not participate in this type of permits. Okay? So to be optimal, so to have an optimal design, a policy requires several characteristics. And in terms of the paternity leave permit, I would talk about 100% paid, non-transferable, and some weeks should be mandatory. Okay, so the paternity leave permit in Spain was introduced in 2007. And of course, it was not that generous since the beginning, and it has suffered a lot of extensions that can be used by researchers to analyze the impact of the reform of each of these extensions in different domains. Okay, so with some of my co-authors, we have analyzed actually the effect on take-up, so the direct effect of the policy. And what we see is that after the reform in 2019, when the permit became mandatory, the take-up rate increased, okay, substantially. And if you look at the picture, what you can see, the blue lines is the take-up by fathers, which is above that of mothers. Okay, this is the number of permits, or so number of permits over number of births. Okay, so why is that of fathers above that of mothers? Because of the eligibility criteria. Okay, so not everyone is eligible. The first condition is that you need to have a job. And because women have a lower labor force participation, then you see this picture here. Okay, so big impact on take-up. Also, fathers are using all the weeks. Okay, because if they cannot be transferred, either you use it or you lose it. Okay, so fathers are using these weeks. And now the effects. Okay? So, in 2019, with Libertad Gonzalez, who is also a professor at the BSc, we looked at the first introduction of the paternity leave permit. Okay, so what we found is the following. Okay, so the permit had limited effects on labor market outcomes, but we see some increases in fathers' participations in household chores. But we also find a delay in the decision to have the next kid. And this had a negative impact on the completed fertility of mature couples. More recently, we've looked at the last extension of the reform in 2021. Okay, so we look at the effects of the equalization of paternity and maternity leave. And what we find is that this last reform reduced the time that infants spent alone with their mothers. And we also find some negative effects on child development, both when we use survey and administrative data. So, how can I summarize the effects of paternity leave on gender equality? So, as I said, the direct effects are huge, so high take up, but limited effects on labor market outcomes, some positive effects on fathers' involvement in household chores, and also some negative effects on fertility and on child development. Okay? So, somehow disappointing the effects on other dimensions. And I think that it's still a good policy, but the effects are going to take time. Okay, so basically, the goal of the policy is challenging. Okay, so far during the last century, we developed policies to increase mothers' involvement in paid work. Okay, so the childcare provision, the maternity leave. Now we are trying to introduce a policy and to make it work, a policy that the goal is to increase fathers' involvement in unpaid work. And this is a much challenging task. Because in part it depends on gender norms. And we know that gender norms change slowly. We have some evidence that the policy affects gender norms among the next generation. But the variation of the effects may still be at an early stage. So maybe we need to be a bit more patient. Okay, so there is some very recent work on Denmark showing that the effects are much more are less limited than what we find in Spain and in other continent. So it has been analyzed in Germany, this policy too. In Denmark, it seems that the effects are more positive. Okay? And now, I've been talking for a long time already, so now it's your turn. What do these word clouds represent? These are the groups with a female PI. Okay, the leader of the group is a woman. And on your right, you have the top keywords of research groups led by men. Okay? So men and women are different in many dimensions, but it seems that in terms of research interest, they are also different. Okay? So it seems that gender is only relevant, or at least one of the priorities of groups led by females. Okay, and then you see some difference. Okay, so women care about now we don't. So yeah, it was public policy, public health, aging, a bit about obesity. Men care more about obesity. Okay, genetics and other differences. Okay. So, what I'm going to be doing now is to briefly talk about gender gaps in research. Okay, so in our profession. Why shall we study gender gaps in research? Well, because again, women are underrepresented in top positions. Okay, so this is the famous scissor graph in academia. Okay, so what you see is that women and men enter the academic career at similar levels, but as they advance, gender gaps appear, right? And they get very large at the top, at the full professor level. Okay, so we're only well, this is for Spain, but it's the same for the US. Okay, so what you have on the left is the share of, so this is the top 5 departments in the US. So on the left, you have the share of women among assistant professors. That's the starting level in academia. And then on your right, you see the share of women among full professors. Again, the scale is different. Okay. So the economics is the black line. Okay. So you see that we start already in disadvantage compared to other fields, but or this not disadvantage. I'm gonna say underrepresentation. Okay. So it we so women are underrepresented at the beginning of the academic career in economics and in many other fields, and these differences become larger as the career advances. Okay, so why is this important? I think that at least there are two reasons. Okay, so it's important for the content of research. Okay, so it may be that if only a fraction of the population needs research, some topics are gonna remain under researched, and this happens a lot in medicine. Okay, if you look at the numbers, it's a bit surprising the differences in research. Um, but also for the way the profession works. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, the underrepresentation of women in some positions may represent a misallocation of talent, and this is also important for the efficiency of our profession. Okay, so we know a little bit of why these gaps are there. So there is an explosive, so there's a lot of papers nowadays working or trying to understand these gaps in academia. So what we know is that women are less productive in terms of publications, okay, and publications are important for the academic career. There are many reasons to account for that, or several reasons that have been analyzed. So, biases in the publication process, the fact that women may be less competitive, the fact that women in academia, as in other professions, devote more time to the family, but also when they are in at work, they invest more time in non-promotable tasks. um, we also see that women have less top 5 publications, but when they get one, they get more citations or they receive more citations, and this has been interpreted by as a fact, or as the fact that women are faced to a higher bar in the publication process. So all these papers I'm citing, by the way, are published in either top or top field economic journals, right? So I'm not referring, so because these results are quite strong, okay? And I'm referring to well published papers. Um, so there is also less recognition to women in teamwork when they work in teams. Female author papers are less likely to be accepted to conferences. Students, and in particular male, are harsher to female professors, more if they are younger and if they teach technical courses. So I teach a technical course, but I'm no longer young, so I hope my evaluations could be good. So gender gaps in access. So there are also gender gaps in access to research funding. Okay. So what we do is to evaluate an affirmative action policy, and now I'm talking about this the last paper I have or I've been working on. So we evaluate an affirmative action policy to promote female talent among research groups in Catalonia. We have administrative data, so actually we have the information on all research groups that apply for funding in these 3 calls. Okay, so the money that you receive in these calls is like peanuts, I would say, but still, the important thing is that there is a high participation rate. So we have a lot of research, or I mean, almost all researchers in Catalonia are in this are in my data set. Okay, and also you know that Catalonia is a hub for research, right? So it's not only the BSc, but there are also very good research centers in the area, right? So we have high quality researchers. So I have information for this, or I have data for these 3 different calls. And I'm evaluating a policy that was introduced in the very last call in 2021. And the policy gave additional points in the evaluation process to if the group was led by a woman. So these additional points was 0.25 out of 10. So it was not a big thing, but it was something. And also if the share of female researchers was above 40%. Okay, so I'm basically evaluating the first policy because the second one was fulfilled by all research groups in general. Okay, so what we find is that as a result of the policy, the share of research groups led by women increased substantially. This was primarily driven by high quality groups that transition from male to female PI. So it was not low quality groups trying to get additional points. Okay. Then what we find is that these additional points actually eliminated pre-reform unexplained penalties faced by female PIs during the evaluation process, increasing their chances for funding. Okay, so the policy had redistributive effects without compromising efficiency. Okay, and finally, in the paper, which is available as a working paper at the BSE, we also show that this is more effective and less costly in promoting female talent than other policies that are widely used, as imposing a minimum share of females in the board of reviewers of anything that happens in the world. Okay, so here my colleagues can testify the fact that they are constantly invited to be in committees just to satisfy the quota. Okay, so yeah, I mean, very briefly, that's the picture. I mean, this is descriptive evidence. Okay, so remember what I told you in class about correlation and causation. That's not causal. This is just descriptive. To see the causal effect, you need to look at the paper. Okay, but I just want to see how to show you how the shares of groups led by women increased, and that the increase was at the descriptive level much higher in STEM disciplines where women are largely underrepresented. Okay, and here what I do in this graph is to show how the policy was effective in reducing. Well, yeah, okay, I had in reducing. So here you see the penalty, and I'm saying penalty, not difference, because here I'm controlling by the quality of the group and the researchers. Okay, so what I see is that women receive lower scores than men when taking the quality into account. And here in this data set, I have the same information that the reviewers have to grade the different projects, right? So I don't have, let's say I don't have, well, yeah, I always have unobserved characteristics, okay? But I have a lot of observables, okay? So I can control for many things when computing this gender difference. And what I see is that the affirmative action points compensated this pre-existing gap. And then it equalized the chances to receive fundings, okay? So I'm going to conclude by saying that there have been important advances in gender equality, but there's still a long way to go, and it requires the involvement of all parties. And of course, this is a very fruitful area of research because there is a lot of data nowadays, high quality data, and also very advanced techniques that allows you to analyze the data. And that's all. And you're going to learn a lot of these techniques during the year. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Lydia. And the floor is open if you have any questions.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So I have two questions, and maybe you can pick which one is more interesting for you to answer. So the first question is, so you had said that there was a stagnation in sort of this convergence between male and female labor force in the last 10 or 15 years, and maybe your research showed that there was some, maybe there were some other reasons that might not necessarily involve sort of cultures. So would also argue that maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this pushback towards traditional values. There has been an emergence of right, center-right movements, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. Is there any research that sort of shows that there is those factors are having an effect on female labor force participation? So that's number one. And maybe a second area is whether gender budgets as they exist right now in several countries and are being introduced as part of government annual budgets, are they supposed to have like a effect on female labor force participation or economic participation, or should they be used more for social justice kind of considerations for women?
Okay. So first question, backlash. Okay. So, I mean, I have one paper in mind and actually just cited on the webpage of the author. Okay. That it's Carlana. You can have a look at it. She's a professor at Harvard, okay? But there's gonna be an explosion of papers on that during the next few months, right? First, because you have this question in surveys, okay? So the question of whether you think that we've gone too far in terms of gender equality. So we have data to analyze heterogeneity in the answer to this question. I'm not sure that you can produce causal evidence on that, right? But at least you can, at the moment, provide some descriptive evidence, and I'm sure that people are gonna be working on experiments and yeah, these discrete choice experiments based on on this methodology to see if this backlash contributes to the stagnation. But the stagnation started mm, a few years before all these tradwife movement and all that began, right? So yeah, I mean, it can be part of the story, but I don't have a scientific answer yet. So yeah, and about the second question, so there are more papers on that, right? So how public spending affects female labor force participation, and this is yeah obvious, right? If you open or if you promote universal childcare, or if you subsidize childcare, this may have, not necessarily, but because the effect is also heterogeneous, but universal public childcare uh, has a positive effect on the labor supply, for instance, of the more disadvantaged women. Okay, because of course this is a so expenditure in childcare is a big part of their budget or the budget in these families. So yeah, of course, like decisions on how the government spends money have an impact on gender gaps. I mean, the paternity leave is one of these policies, right, that may have an impact.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really beneficial. I'm glad I got on the bus for an hour to come here. Um, my question was about one of your slides. You showed the percentage of female faculty members, and there was a very big difference when it came to academic departments. Like I think sociology and psychology were on top, and economics was near the bottom. What are the most important variables in determining whether or not a field is going to have more faculty members than others?
More faculty, you mean more female?
Faculty.
Well, that's related to the absence or the factors that explain the underrepresentation of women in STEM. Okay, so there is a large literature on that, and many factors influence these choices, right? For instance, role models, preferences, the peers, right? So the percentage of people you think are gonna be in your class. Several things can explain this segregation at early stages of the not when you decide to do a PhD, right? Because all these people took the decision, so they went into academia, but already at university, you see that females are only 25% of students in STEM fields. And yeah, also the role that teachers play, right? So there is also some evidence that teachers at high school or at primary school have an impact on these choices, right? So that they have so they transmit certain beliefs to kids that influence their decisions.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was very nice. I have a question about the compensation of the unpaid labor for men. So, basically, like, we're doing now paternity leave, but what would happen, or like, is there any research on better compensating the unpaid labor of women, and kind of also supporting, of course, the career, because it's also time lost of career development. But I don't know. I'm thinking now we're increasing unpaid labor, kind of. Uh, but what about maintaining the same level but compensating for it better?
Well, you can, oh, I mean, there is some work on that. You can have a look at the work by Andrea Ichino and others, Barbara Petrongolo, okay, where they suggest different taxes on female labor supply. Okay, and that's the only thing I've seen, like proper research.
Thank you for your lecture. And my question relates to the fertility rate. And I was wondering if you have any insight into causes in the reduction of the fertility rate. I mean, over the last kind of 20 to 30 years, but then more generally in some countries over the last, let's say, 200 years.
Okay,
Thank
so I'm going to recommend you two papers, okay? Well, three. The first one is my paper with Libertad published in 2019, where we talk about it already, but also a paper by Matthias Doebken and co-authors, and a recent working paper by Claudia Goldin. Okay, so what these papers say is that, well, the one by Claudia Goldin is very easy to read and very clear, right? So the fact that women are gaining agency, okay, so they work, they go to university, they go to college and so on, right? So it makes kids much more costly for women. And then, there is evidence, and Claudia shows some very nice graphs in the paper, but also the paper by Matthias is very nice. The title of the paper by Doebken is Bargaining Over Kids, okay? So it's this idea that and that's how Claudia writes it in the paper, when there are supportive partners, it's less costly to have a kid. And though fertility is dropping in all countries, what you see is that in countries more egalitarian, such as the Scandinavian countries, where the participation of men in home production is higher, the drop or the fertility rate drops, but at a slower pace, right? So the role of men is very important in understanding the drop in fertility.
Lydia, thank you so much for that. That was great. I just had a question on wealth rather than income. I see there's loads of research on, or stuff that you've done on, equal maternity and paternity leave. But if you go sort of a few years forward when it comes to some more part-time childcare necessities, it's usually women that work part-time over men. And in the long term, women's wealth, aggregate wealth, declines a lot compared to men, especially when it comes to pensions. And like you've mentioned, changing social norms is sort of the way when it comes to gender gaps. Have you got any suggestions, or is there any research on how to combat that rather than just the either hourly or annual wage of women and men?
But it's about wealth or it's about pensions, your question? Gender gaps in
Uh,
pensions?
well, I saw it more of a hand in hand thing, just aggregating. Well, I didn't know if
So,
they were
okay,
different.
so I recently I was asked to give a talk on pensions, and this is something I was trying to avoid, right? Because it was like too far away for me, like talking about pensions. But yeah, okay, so pensions are something important, and actually gender gaps in pensions are very important, right? And it's a big issue in all countries, because actually we have gender gaps in pensions because these gaps are reflecting the graph I showed you at the beginning, right? So women were either not working or working part time. So I think that part time is a policy that can be considered as the extreme case of flexibility, right? So you work part time. This policy has been useful to increase female labor force participation or labor market attachment, but at the cost of reducing their career opportunities, right? So there is always this trade off between flexibility and career progression, right? So you have to be, again, very careful of how you design policies because, yeah, of course, it's better to have them working part-time. But I think that if we want to solve the gender gap in pensions problem, we really need to guarantee that women work full-time.
Thank you very much, Lydia. I thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And now time for second part. This has been one very good reason to come. And we hope that what's coming next is the second good reason to take 1 hour train ride.